Hi everyone, you're welcome to the Style My Bum series. This is Kema Freak. My name is Kemi Omorugbe. In this video, I want to show you how to make a fitted bodycon dress suitable for a pregnant woman. When making a bodycon dress, one thing you want to get right is the texture and the feel of the fabric. I am using this, I honestly don't know the name of this fabric. But then it is stretchy on both sides. As you can see, it is light, it feels cool on the skin. For a bodycon dress, you can have a zip at the back, you can have a zip at the side, but if your fabric is very stretchy, you honestly don't even need a zip. You can definitely play around with the style of the neckline and the style of the sleeve. I'll be making use of a pleating technique to add fullness around the bump. You can apply this same technique for any other maternity outfit, even if it's with a non-stretchy fabric. It works very well. Like you're making Ankara, Ashwebi, and you want a way to add fullness around the bump. Using the pleating technique is just the best way to go. Without taking much of your time, let's get on to the video. I have divided my paper into two and I'll be drafting the front bodies on this side. I am marking a neckline width and depth of 4 inches by 4 inches respectively, and I went ahead to draw out the neckline curve. I'll be sloping this shoulder by 1.5 inches, and if you know how to draft a basic bodice block, that's just exactly what I am doing. It is not just a basic bodice block because it's a full dress. So here I am marking my chest line and creating the front armhole. I measured the distance between the shoulder and the chest line and divided it into two, came inward by 0.75 inches to draw the armhole curve right there. Next, I marked the front half length of 18 inches, bust point of 11 inches. Now you don't necessarily need a dart for this, but I decided to make use of the bust dart only, and that particular dart was transferred to the shoulder eventually. So I also marked out the hip line and the full length of this dress according to my measurement. Once that was done, I proceeded to mark out the horizontal measurement. That's the circumference divided by 4 for the butt, the waist, and also the hip. And I did the same thing for the hem, and I just connected all the dots right there. I made the hem slightly smaller than the measurement for the hip, I think about 2 inches, I'm not even sure. And here I am creating the dart line. I marked the bust span divided by 2, and I have 4 inches from the center front, so I marked my line right there. Here I created my bust dart. I came downward by 2 inches from the bust line right there to create my dart. So I marked the midpoint of the shoulder and connected it to the bust point because I'll be transferring the bust dart to the shoulder, just because my design allows me to use that. Now onto the back pattern. A major difference between the front and the back pattern is the zipper allowance, and like I mentioned earlier on, you don't necessarily need a zipper allowance. I actually ended up not using mine, and I marked the same neckline width of 4 inches but neckline depth of 1 inch for the back, and then I sloped the shoulder by 1 inch. And just like I did for the front, I'm creating the chest line. Then I marked out the back half length, which is 2 inches shorter than the front half length, and from that point I measured the hip line and also the full length of the back. You must notice that that back ended up being 2 inches shorter than the front, right? So I also marked my horizontal circumferences divided by 4, right, and connected the side like so. Now I decided to tighten the back a little bit, so I connected the neckline to the waistline, slanting the zipper allowance by 1 inch, and See guys, I don't even know how to explain this, but you must have seen me do this a couple of times. So I slanted from the waistline down to the hip line again, and from the hip line, or some inches below the hip line, I took away half an inch from the hem. So all the inches I took away, I added them back at the side. Once again, I took away 1 inch from the waistline and 1 inch from the hem, so I replaced them. I think that explains it better, right? So here I am cutting out the curve I just created for the center back. This just allows your zip to sit into the body much better, and sometimes I slant by just 1 inch, but because this is a stretchy fabric, I decided to go, sorry, sometimes I slant by half an inch. So for the neckline, I decided to create like a small style for the neckline, which I eventually don't even think I liked it that much. But yeah, I marked out a V shape right there, which I will be cutting out. But then I want to know the width of the bias tape to use for that design, so I marked out like 3 layers of bias tape that I'll be using to design that part, and I eventually measured it just so I know the width to cut. Okay, so here I am closing up the bust dart and opening up the shoulder dart. This opening is going to serve as the channel now for us to attach the flare sleeve I am adding to this outfit. And here I am marking notches to the main pattern, just so I'll be able to notch the fabric and know exactly where my bias tape should rest. I also took out the measurements of the strips I created, so that, and then I wrote it on the paper, okay, so that I won't forget. So for the back as well, I decided to slash it as well, so the sleeve will be continuous from the front to the back. And here I marked the same distance. You can alter it. I just decided to make use of the same length of shoulder dart that the front had. So I marked the center of my pattern. I'll be splitting this open and we'll sew our sleeve into it. So here is my slash lines for pleats. I told you I was going to incorporate pleats into this pattern for added fullness along the bump. So I just marked ½ inch apart and I'll be spreading by 1 inch. I marked 4 of them. Okay, so we'll be having 4 pleats, ½ an inch apart, and the width of each plate will be 1 inch. I hope you understand. So I am spreading and placing this pattern on another paper so I can then cut it out and transfer this pattern to fabric. Along the neckline, I have ½ an inch seam allowance, and for this dart as well, because I'm going to be sewing it back, I added ½ an inch seam allowance and tapered it sharply towards the bust point, such that when I'm sewing, I'll also sew it the way you sew it dart. Okay, you need it to be sharp so that it doesn't look awkward. So along the armhole, we have ½ an inch, and the side we have 1 inch side seam allowance. You can definitely make use of ½ an inch. Okay, the center front is on fold in case you didn't notice that. So here I am notching the position of my bias tapes. This helped a great deal, so I didn't have to start wondering where to place the bias tapes. At this point, I realized I will need to add ½ an inch to the back shoulder dart, and then add 1 inch to the armhole, just to make up for the 1 inch seam allowance I'll be needing to sew my slash right back when the sleeve is added to it. So along the side as well, we have 1 inch, just like we had for the front. And I also went ahead to cut out my curvy shape at the back without an allowance, because, well, it's already a 1 inch zipper allowance, right? So here I am cutting my sleeve. My fabric was not enough for a flare sleeve, so I decided to make like a curvy sleeve. It was not a full circle or a half circle. anything, but I made it curvy and I added excesses to it so that I can pleat it right back. Okay, I didn't want it to just be plain. I wanted pleat on the sleeve, so I made it longer than necessary so I can have the excess to pleat in. So also along one side of it, I tapered it to make it smaller, okay, than the center part of it. So here I am creating my pleats. I love to do this before going to sew, and what I'm doing basically is placing my notch over the next notch, creating my pleats. By the time you fold the pleats, it's a half an inch pleat, but then I made use of 1 inch fabric. Does that make sense? When you fold 1 inch, you have half an inch, right? And it's just half an inch apart. I did the same thing on the both sides of this fabric. Next, my bias tape. Okay, I took the measurements, I wrote down. That was what helped me here. So I just cut my strips according to the measurement on the paper and placed them right on my notches. I went ahead to stitch it down. After stitching in the bias tape, I went ahead to use another bias tape, okay, to turn the V-shaped part of this neckline. I stitched by half an inch. Remember, we have half an inch on the fabric, but then on the bias tape it's 1/4 of an inch. I hope you understand that. The first seam was easy, guys. No issue with the first seam. So I did that. After that first seam, I trimmed the excess 1/4 of an inch allowance away from the fabric and proceeded to turn my bias tape like so. Now everything was going well. It was going well till I reached the apex of the V shape, guys. This part actually stressed me. It stressed me. So I continued sewing and I realized that part didn't want to rest well. So what I did, I actually snipped the bias a little bit for more ease, but I won't recommend you do that anyways. I don't even want to show it but then I manipulated my way around it, trust me. But I will advise that you make use of a facing rather than bias tape for this part of your own project. Okay, don't try this at home. Now this doesn't look bad from the right side. From the wrong side, well, there is a manipulation right there, but yeah, this is what we have. And now I'll be placing the right side of the back over the right side of the front to sew in the shoulder. So remember, our shoulder is cut into two, right? So you just sew them separately like so, leaving the center open for the sleeve attachment. Now here's our sleeve. It is actually curvy on both sides, but I guess this bias tape is not doing it justice. I told my tailor to sew the other parts, to sew the bias tape on the other part, but she ended up doing it this way, and I thought, okay, let's experiment. I'd like to see how this looks. So I snipped the center right there and placed that center on the shoulder line. Then I created pleats on the sleeve. Okay, I didn't pleat the first 5 to 6 inches right there, but I pleated the other part. But just make sure that the center of this sleeve aligns with the shoulder line. Do the same thing on the other side. I am measuring the parts without pleats to ensure that it is the same thing for the front and for the back. But you can definitely decide to pleat your sleeve all the way, okay, not just towards the shoulder. So having created my pleats, I went ahead to place the other side of the shoulder over it, sandwiching the sleeve in between the two sides of the shoulder, and I sew by half an inch. Now, because I am not making use of a lining for each step, I had to keep overlocking. So please do the same so that you can have a neat job. So at this point I decided I don't even want to attach a zip to this because the fabric is quite stretchy, and rather than use my bias tape to turn the top of the V shape, I decided to leave it open so that my head the head can easily enter into the neckline, so I won't need the zip. Okay, so that was what I did. I sealed down my 1-inch zip allowance, but you don't have to do that anyways. You can decide to put your zip depending on the texture of the fabric you're using. And I went ahead to use the bias tape to turn the neckline. Here I created my pleats, although we have created it earlier on, right? So I put the right side of the back over the right side of the front and went ahead to stitch the side seam allowance just the same way I use bias tape for the neckline. I did the same thing for the armhole so that we can have that grain highlight on the actual armhole now, not on the sleeve, the part where I place the sleeve. Am I making sense, guys? Okay, I stitched my side seam by 1-inch side seam allowance, and here is my finished work. So mine isn't very tight because if you notice I didn't take out of my actual measurement. This is just the regular measurement I will have used for a non-stretchy fabric, so it is loose. I wanted that room, but you can decide to make yours fit tighter by not adding any seam allowance and then taking out the 1-inch side seam allowance from the fabric. Okay, thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye.